I recently had a discussion with Dr. Dennis Edwards, who is the current Vice President for Church Relations as well as the Dean of the Seminary at North Park University in Chicago. Dr. Edwards received a Ph.D. in Biblical Studies from the Catholic University of America. He's also been a church planner and pastor. He's contributed to numerous volumes. Two of his authored works include Might from the Margins, and then the book that he and I discussed today. It's entitled Humility Illuminated, and the subtitle is The Biblical Path Back to Christian Character. I thought this was a really good discussion about his book, about humility, about the ways that it's been lost and ways we can rediscover it. So I hope you enjoy it. Well, Dennis, thanks for Dr. Edwards. Thanks for taking the time to talk today about your book, Humility Illuminated. Just finished it recently and loved it. So let's start with, what led to the writing of the book? How'd you come to be interested and then decide to devote the time and energy it takes to write a book on this trait?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and certainly you can call me Dennis. I have had been thinking about humility a lot because people would use the term in my church world, coming up as a young guy, but I honestly didn't really know what they meant. Or even if they said that I was humble at times, I didn't know what that meant. And it was a mixed bag of things for me, just self-deprecation, all kinds of things. And so when I was talking to publishers about ideas that I wanted to write on, they suggested humility. I said, I've been thinking about that. So it was the kind of thing that dovetailed well with my pastoral experience and then also my New Testament interest because I've been intrigued by the topic biblically as well. So those things kind of converged. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Um, I started like in 2005 getting interested, and it's been great. And since then, when I kind of the same thing, I started looking at what Christian ethicists and philosophers said, and there just wasn't a lot there, but there's been a lot more attention, relatively at least. So I was encouraged when I saw your book come out and
Thank you.
seeing other people. Marlena Graves wrote a book a couple of years ago
Right.
that I thought was really
Right.
good. So,
Yes. In fact,
um,
Marlena does the forward on mine because
oh, that's right.
her the way up is down was, I mean, it's somewhat cliche to say it that way, but she engages the topic very well. And I think also from a, respecting sort of the Christian tradition in
Hmm.
ways, maybe even monastic tradition in some ways that more so than I did. So I thought, yeah, I wanted to come at it a little bit differently. But I agree with you. I've been seeing a growth in this topic, and I'm glad for that, considering
Yeah.
our landscape right now.
Yeah, I think if I could pick one virtue, it'd probably be that, along with love. But on that, then, how would you, kind of what's the main message or main idea of the book, for someone who might be thinking about reading it?
Right. I try to define humility, even though I don't spend a whole lot of time just, beating down the definition. I do try to define it as coming from a place of submission to God. And so I even thought about calling the book like biblical humility or Christian, because I felt like I wanted to have an adjective that somehow said that I'm framing this thing from my scripture study. But the goal of the book, or at least the summary of the book, would be to say, if humility starts with submission to God, how does it play itself out in our relationship with other people? And I try to then spell it out in different scenarios. And those scenarios are things that came through my pastoral experience. So how does it play itself out in our communal life, in our conflicts with other people, or even just how we do worship as Christian communities? So that's really the summary. What is humility and how does it play itself out with our neighbors?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I've noticed like when I did the work with philosophers, there was a lot of people and Christian thinkers too that focused primarily on humility is how you see yourself, not thinking too highly of yourself, which of course is part of it, but
Sure.
but I think you're right. I think when you actually read, like I would think of Philippians 2 when Paul treats it, that it's much more a God's focused and other human. It's like a relational virtue. It's not just how I see
Yeah.
myself. That's actually secondary from the Christian view, which I think makes it unique.
Amen. You said that well. It's not just how I see myself, but it's these interactions with others and with God, a posture, if you will. So yeah, thank you. I think you summarized that well.
Yeah, well, I think kind of relates to my next question is why do you think there's so much confusion about humility these days? I mean, you kind of said what you think it is, but why do you think, why are we confused about it, like you mentioned?
Maybe, yeah, maybe because we don't have great models or we haven't, that's one piece of it. But I
Mm,
also think it's because our culture is such that, and when I say our now, I guess I'm talking United States maybe, that there's that we tend to celebrate things that are um, stark, in your face, um, and not what we might call humble, things that are so attention getting and competitive, I would say, that the idea of service to others or the idea of somehow um, being deferential in certain ways or in certain spaces seems like weakness. So I think in our society, the confusion is born out of a misunderstanding of equating humility with weakness and passivity. And who wants that? Oh, so and some of the devotional literature out there, I thought gets there. You know, it kind of almost paints this picture of us as being so servile that who would want to pursue that? And why would that be a good thing in our world? So I think that that's one of the sources of confusion that we see humility as something that's written about in the Bible, in the scriptures, but then when we see it modeled, it's somehow pushed out as this docility and weakness and passivity that it makes us confused or not eager to pursue it.
mm. Yeah, I'm going just off memory now, so, and you may
Yeah.
not remember either because people ask me about books I've written, and I'm like, I don't. It's
I think I
I'd have
said
to go.
that right.
Yeah, but I think was some of the docility and being servile, was that some of the stuff that was present in Andrew Murray's when you discuss it
Yes.
on humility, which is kind of a I mean, it's one of the it pops up a lot, but
Oh, it does. It does.
yeah.
And I was a little nervous about going there because folks, see this mystic as such a, like an iconic figure for a lot of Christians in terms of pursuing virtues. I mean, he's got some other books on prayer and all of these different things. So, but in that book, and I'm not saying it's all like problematic, but I am saying there are places in there where this really lowly view of oneself, seeing oneself as small and insignificant, um, um, is something that he pushes and celebrates and advocates. And I do read the scriptures from my lens as an African American, a kind of a minoritized Bible reader. And I thought, if that's the case, then why would any of my people want to be, pursue the way of Jesus if it means that my position is supposed to be servile and docile, and that God wants that, or that I'm supposed to see myself as insignificant when so many others are seeing me that way, but they don't see me as godly. So there was confusion from that. So yes, I do think some of the devotional material pushes a certain kind of docility and almost nothingness to our humanness that was problematic for me.
Yeah, I've seen that. I read a lot of the monastic stuff back when I was writing an academic book on humility, and I saw some of that too. And you can take phrases or sentences, and sometimes I'm sure they're saying what they mean, but I think like, well, look, as from a white male experience, those things when I think of being, or when I used to think about it, I would think, yeah, humble, almost to those extremes, but it's a lot easier to do that when you're kind of so in society. I step down, but when you're already like kept down, there's a different kind of so it means different things in the context, I think. And I think you're right, it doesn't mean, I mean, Jesus was humble and he was far from servile or docile, he was
Thank you.
sacrificial. um
Thank you. That's the
yeah,
model I wanted to return to. Yeah, thank you. I think
yeah.
that's
And that does relate. The next question I wanted to ask is, what do you think the relevance of humility is for people, more than what you said in marginalized groups or oppressed groups, especially given the way, in our history and in other parts of the world, it's a virtue that really has been weaponized or distorted to keep some people out of power, keep some people in power.
yes. And I appreciate you asking that because I struggled with that from the very outset. I mean, there's one thing to be said, like say, if we just have a personal relationship, we know each other, you and me, and we say, well, we're gonna be we're going to care for our relationship in such a way that we're going to respect each other, and all that sounds great. But then when but when you start expanding out and look at people who've been pushed to the side of society, might come to faith and read these scriptures and say, well, wait, emptying ourselves, this is what you want, and see how we've been taken advantage of. So I was struggling with that. And in my last chapter, I call it empowering because I wanted to live into this notion of that scriptural refrain that keeps showing up, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. I wanted to say, what might that mean for people who've been on the margins and been oppressed, or humility's been weaponized, as you put it. And I guess I've come to the place that it doesn't excuse us, but from being Christ-like. In fact, what it says is we become now the models of what Christ-likeness is, because we've been walking with Christ even when the rest of society has denigrated us to some degree or another. So we become models of what humility looks like by standing firm and remaining in the faith, even when these tremendous headwinds. Um, and I mean that's an oversimplification, but that's the idea I try to get at, is that rather than asking people on the bottom to go lower, I say, wait a second, to the people who've been on the top, so to speak, notice that those folks on the bottom have something that you lack, and see them as leaders because they are teachers for us. Yet at the same time, I want folks who have been pushed to the side to trust that there's a God who does empower, so that showing favor to the humble, to say the way you've been taken advantage of and held on, and your faith has been tenacious in that, that gets rewarded in some way or another.
Hmm. Yeah, and something that I remember reading and thinking about this, that so if you think of like humility, well, in Philippians is kind of putting the interests of others ahead of your own,
Right.
and I think, and I can't remember if it was Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or both, but I remember reading one of them or maybe both discussing this, and part of the resistance to like humility is in that context is actually good for the oppressor because it's bad for that person in power who's exploiting people to be in that position, right? So humility that challenges that along with other virtues, maybe see what you think about this. It seems right to me. It's not just, it is still other centered because it's out of that radical Christian love for even your enemy, right? That you're trying to do good for them, and their good is not to leave things as they are, just like your good isn't. So
Right. That's a good example, Mike. I wrote a different book called Mike from the Margins, where I tried to say that there's power, um, the power of God is present in folks who've been marginalized. And for me, especially I guess at my age and being, Black, is that I think of the civil rights movement a lot in that way, at least, some wings of the civil rights movement. When I look at the work of Dr. King or John Lewis, and people who kind of put their lives on the line for this nonviolent resistance, in many ways, they showed a humility that shamed, the those who might name Christ but didn't understand what real humility looked like. So I wouldn't ask necessarily folks to go lower, but I would say those who've held on, as I was saying, kind of been tenacious about their faith, they would be the models for those who have been part of that oppressive group. So
yeah,
yeah, you said it well. Thank you.
yeah, I love that idea of role model or exemplar. And we need more of those. Which this isn't even on purpose; it's just natural flow. But the next question has to do, like in your view, in your mind, why do you think this virtue, I guess, is just important for Christians in general? But then,
Right.
in particular, why is it important for people with leadership roles, whether it's church or ministry or educational institution like yours? What are
Right.
some thoughts about that?
Well, I think of a lot, and as I was writing too, was thinking a lot about our polarized society. And now, I mean, when you asked me at the beginning what led to the writing, I didn't want to just look at the society and say, hey, I'm going to try to fix the world's problems. It was born out of something in me. But as I was writing, I couldn't help but to think about how polarized we are right now in Christian circles and beyond, and thought, if there was a way that we could recover what humility is, and take it seriously, not just a passive kind of oh yes, humility is one of those, good words or something. But if we took it seriously, I honestly think it could change the landscape of things. And some of our polarities, well, they'll get exposed for what they are. Maybe we also will be more open to the truth of some things and not buy lies, because I think that's happening too in our spaces. And so for me, it's something that would be healing for us as Christian people. But then there's also a witness aspect to it too. It also communicates something to those who aren't Christian people but are looking at the church, that if we could embrace and practice humility, there would be a sense that, oh yeah, these folks manage their differences in a different way. They don't do it the same way as everyone else. Something I said in the book that I was getting from some New Testament scholarship was how humility was seen as an identity marker. That was the terminology some scholars were using, an identity marker in the ancient world because it stood in such contrast to the way Greco-Roman society operated. I honestly think that could be true here too. If we saw how radical humility was, it would be a witnessing, a testimony to the rest of the world. And for leaders, of course, leaders often set the tone for the rest of the group. So if leaders could demonstrate genuine humility, then I think that others would see it as the strength that it is, that it's a courageous posture to take and not a domineering one, that would open a whole new way of being for us in our Christian communities. Yeah, so that's what I'm
Mm,
thinking. It's important for us for witness, but also for our own health.
yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it's interesting in that Philippians passage too. The whole context is it's a body of believers, right? So it's people that you've got a shared faith. I mean, that's who he's addressing it to. I mean, it's
Right,
relevant beyond that,
right,
but yeah, it's like all those virtue lists. They're relational, right? They're just such a concern for the unity of Christians, and
right.
yeah,
There
so
is,
I
there
like
is,
that.
Mike. I do too. But the thing that intrigues me about Philippi in particular is at least the somewhat understanding I have for Philippi. And I mean, I won't go too far afield on this, but in Acts, Luke calls it a leading city and a colony of Rome. So his readers know how important this city was. Paul, I think most scholars would agree, he uses language in Philippians that's somewhat unique in his writings that seems to speak to their prominent position in Roman society. So, military kind of language, and this was a place that had some strong military roots, named for Philip of Macedon, all that kind of stuff. But it would also know how power operates. So you've got enslaved people probably as part of that congregation, because Euodia and Syntyche, they are names of people that may have been likely have been enslaved. So that adds a whole nuance to that Philippians 2 passage, that consider others better yourself. That's asking people who know how power operates to then look over at their enslaved Christian counterparts and consider their needs. And that's something that's so countercultural that I I feel like that had to have been a radical thing for people to see, in Philippi. So that's the kind of thing I want for us, today, to be that kind of radical witness to the rest of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, one last question. What are some thoughts or ideas you have like about sort of practical ways to cultivate humility? Like someone says, I want to grow in humility. I mean, I think a lot of
Yeah.
things jump to mind, but what are some things that strike you as maybe a good starting point or most helpful?
Well, since I do argue that humility starts as a posture of submission to God, I mean, I think there's one place that I mean, maybe it's obvious, but I want to say it. It's that we would look at our own kind of communication with God, how willing we are to sit and listen with God. And I don't just mean bargaining or just doing a quick, hasty Bible reading, but to maybe listen, to have that posture of listening with God, but then also a posture of listening to others, particularly those that society doesn't often pay attention to, folks who are marginalized because of their ethnic background or because of their gender. I mean, there's women have had a subservient role in our society for a long time. So there's questions about how willing are men to listen to women uh, in a instructional way. So I would say there's a discipline of learning how to listen to God, listen to others, and then before we start coming up with a list of actions, is to maybe explore in my listening to those folks, what are the needs that people are expressing that I could then come in and be helpful for. So I don't want to assume that you need me to do X. But if you and I became friends and we started working, I would say, oh, this is what is important to Mike, and this might be what is helpful to Mike. So those kinds of things are born out of my sensitivity to others. So I want us to cultivate that kind of sensitivity to others. And again, I'm a New Testament person and a pastor. I'm not a psychologist or anything like that. So I don't know the mechanics of how those things all happen, but I do know that that's the kind of thing I would value and I try to do in my own life. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. That's definitely in the past few years, just I've kind of revolutionized my approach. One, just telling God what I really think when I'm talking to God and not
Yeah.
filtering it and using the right words. I mean, my whole, as
Right.
you know, as a philosopher, academic, it's all about the right words.
That's right.
And also just telling them how I really feel. But also, as you mentioned, just sitting there, just being quiet before God. And it's amazing if you just give the spirit space, things will come up over time. And but that even that's humbling, right? 'Cause it's like I've got stuff to do. I can't just sit here and be quiet.
Telling you, man, you're hitting a lot of things that Dennis had to learn in the last few years.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, because I'm the kind of person that does like to move and get stuff done and all of that. And we only all got the 24 hours in a day and all those things. But I've been learning. I mean, okay, the psychologist folks talk about mindfulness and all that, but there really is something to this, and in
Mhm.
my relationship with God, where I can stop and be and slow down and listen, and that in and of itself is an act of humility because it says I don't know all that I should be doing right now. I don't know all the answers. I don't know all of that, but I'm willing to slow down and let God show me through the Spirit. So thank you for saying that. That's where I'm at on this.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I appreciate the book, of course, and I appreciate you taking the time today. So thanks for answering the questions. It was a good discussion. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure, and thank you so much for reaching out.
You bet.